Well, this is the beginning of our conversation with Nick Hedley. Today, we are going to be exploring everything to do with the energy transition and what your business needs to know about that transition at this point. So, I just want to say welcome to those that have joined us already for the conversation. I notice, the audience coming in, and that's really great. This is going to be a collaborative conversation because we want you as audience members, and Joseph will mention this in a little bit more detail, to join us in the conversation, because your insights from wherever you are in the world, the questions that you may have, can really help us to flesh out this concept of the energy transition and what it means, for you and for your business and for the country that you're in, etc. So, we normally start off our conversations with an introduction for Joseph and myself. But what I want to do today is just say to you, if you want to find out a little bit more about who we are, that's Joseph and myself, you can simply click through to our LinkedIn profiles and you can see exactly what we're up to. So we're gonna spare you that conversation. What we would rather do is get right into the conversation. So, any comments from you, Joseph, before we kick off with Nick's conversation?
Yeah, just really, I think leveraging what you're talking about in terms of, these ideally are interactive conversations. It's not really about us three up on the stage talking and everyone else kind of being a passive listener. So what I would really encourage people to do is to get involved in the conversation sooner rather than later. Because one of the things that I've noticed as we've been doing these LinkedIn Live audios this year is that we tend to get largely silence from the audience for most of the hour. And then in the last 15 minutes, people start putting their hands up and wanting to say things. And they've got lots of insightful comments, but they come quite late and we never get the time to deal with all of those comments. So my one point is, if you've got something interesting to say, I'm sure everybody would be interested in it. Don't feel shy, get involved sooner rather than later, and that will maximize the chance of you being able to speak.
Great stuff. Thank you, Joseph. So, we've got, as I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, as you can see, also the title of our event tonight. We've got Nick Hedley with us. He's a journalist that has been covering the climate crisis and issues related to climate and the energy transition. So we're really looking forward to his insights. He has a lot of experience, obviously, in South Africa, but also internationally. I think Nick at the moment is in Switzerland or somewhere, and will be in Europe for the foreseeable future. But maybe, Nick, before we get going with what we are dying to ask you, just a little bit about your background, what it is that you're busy with at the moment, before we get into the conversation.
Cool. Yeah, Peter, thanks for having me. So I studied economics. I worked at Business Day newspaper for a couple of years. Spent some time in Hong Kong in an investment data company. And I've worked in climate communications as well, as corporate PR and a little bit of sort of economic and climate consulting. I'm now full-time freelance, so doing a bit of writing and doing a bit of research on the side. So a little bit of everything to do with business and climate at the moment.
Great. So with that kind of background, it's little doubt in my mind as to what you are busy doing and what you share with the world. For those of you that aren't following Nick, you can follow him obviously here on LinkedIn, which is a good suggestion to do. But you can also see a lot of his updates that he shares on Twitter as well. So what I'd like to do, Nick, is to get right into this conversation. So, you talk about the danger of or the cost of inaction when it comes to the energy transition, whether that be for a business or for a country. Using like the South African example, just as a kickoff point, talk to us a little bit more about that concept, the cost of inaction at this point.
Yeah. So the South African example, I think, is the easiest one to make. and that's partly because of carbon border taxes.
Okay, we seem to have just lost Nick.
So countries to the EU, also UK, Canada, and so on, are basically preparing to raise taxes on goods imported from carbon-intensive economies. And South Africa, being the most carbon-intensive economy in the G20, is the world's most exposed country to the EU's carbon border taxes, according to an analysis by S&P. So no other country will be hit as hard as South Africa when the EU starts basically taxing goods coming from South Africa just because of the carbon content of those goods. So the reason South Africa will be hit the hardest is because of our extremely unusually high reliance on coal for electricity, and also because of the mix of our exports to the EU. So iron and steel, which both require huge amounts of energy, and in South Africa that all come from coal, almost all. They account for a huge share of our exports to Europe. So according to a couple of numbers thrown around by different research houses, but S&P estimates that in the 15 years to 2040, the EU's carbon border tax could cost South Africa $92 billion. So, I mean, that's a massive hit to our exports, particularly of iron and steel, but also of fertilizer, cement, aluminium, chemicals, and things like that. And then also down the line, other goods, including things like agricultural goods. So the World Bank says about half of our current exports are at risk of being penalized by the carbon border tax. Carbon border tax is obviously very controversial, but they're unfair in one way, but they're kind of unavoidable in another way. So obviously unfair in that they're penalizing developing countries like South Africa, which should take longer in the transition, and that's only fair. But at the same time, Europe already has extremely high carbon taxes of now around 100 euros a ton. So if they don't impose carbon border taxes, European manufacturers will simply just say, okay, well, we'll just move our operations to a country like South Africa because there we won't have to pay high carbon taxes. So the whole point of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is to sort of shut down those loopholes. So it is unfair on the one hand, but it kind of is fair and makes sense on the other. So that is, to me, the biggest sort of risk of the cost of inaction. But there are a whole lot of other risks as well. One is that countries and companies that sort of maintain a heavy reliance on fossil fuels will really struggle to attract investment and capital, and including bank lending, equity, and things like that over time, as companies and banks and investors aim to decarbonize their portfolios. There's also the physical cost of inaction. There's climate-related damages, which the World Bank estimates that climate-related damages will cost South Africa's economy 1.5 trillion rand in net present value in the coming 2.5 decades or so. It's not actually as much as other economies, and that's partly just because we have a relatively small agricultural sector. So countries with large agricultural sectors will feel the pain the most because of sort of extreme weather impacts on agriculture. There's also obviously the cost related with air pollution and premature deaths. Another thing to consider is insurance. So insurance groups already saying they might have to soon start withdrawing coverage for homes and businesses in areas that are prone to extreme weather events like flooding. And in KZN, South Africa's east coast, there's already some concerns that some areas might become sort of uninsurable. So it's and one last thing to add, I guess, is the cost of inaction at a large corporate. If you're relying on Eskom's coal-heavy electricity mix, you're going to have constant escalations in tariffs, which are increasingly going to sort of rise way above the cost of a solar and battery installation, for example. So you'll be paying for increasingly unreliable and increasingly expensive electricity if you fail to act.
So for those of you
So Nick, you've been giving us some ideas here. Sorry, Peter, you've been giving us some ideas here about the kind of problems that people are going to face, and I think we discuss problems endlessly, right? Can you look at the flip side of this and talk a little bit about give some examples of either at the small level, like businesses, in the medium level, like civic institutions, or potentially even at the macro level, like sovereign nations, people who are actually doing a decent job of positioning themselves within the energy space to try and mitigate some of these problems that you've just identified?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with one sort of very small niche example in Africa, and that's Gambia. So carbon markets are another very important sort of tool for raising capital for companies and countries that otherwise would struggle to raise capital for the energy transition. So Gambia is tapping into the massive carbon credits market and basically monetizing their forests. So the options with that forest land would either be to demolish the forests and set up, let's say, an oil industry, for example, or monetize those forests and sell carbon credits linked to the preservation of those forests to a polluter in Europe, let's say. It's very complicated, and there's a lot still to iron out in the global carbon credits market, but there are opportunities for companies and countries that are looking to sort of go sustainable and get in on the transition. Another one is obviously green finance and green bonds. There's the appetite for lending in the green finance space is massive. And I think a good example here might be, again, just using the South Africa example, South Africa's healthcare companies like Mediclinic and Netcare, they've really tapped into that green finance market and have raised capital for things like water desalination, grey water harvesting, renewable energy. So they're going quite big on solar and batteries. And actually, it's a quite a good case study is South Africa's hospital groups. They right up there with the global leaders in terms of transitioning for a more sustainable future. And because of that, they've been able to raise a huge amount of sustainable finance, sustainable bonds, and also be included in world global indices of sustainable equities. So access to capital becomes, with a bit of ambition, access to capital becomes a whole lot easier, and that sustainable finance market is only going to grow.
So do you think the onus of responsibility here is really on these bigger players? We haven't. Do you? At what point does it become unfeasible, too small to take these kinds of energy transition issues seriously? I mean, small businesses, individuals, everything you've been talking about at the moment has been at the larger level. At what point do you think we kind of just need to, it's not really our responsibility as an SME or an individual? Where's the cutoff point?
Good question. I think everyone has a responsibility, firstly, and an opportunity, no matter how big or small the company might be. So an SME doesn't want to be paying electricity costs that are rising 16% a year in the case of Eskom, and being cut off from power for 10 hours a day. So every company has opportunities to go this route. I think the tricky bit is access to finance, but that's an area that's being solved quite quickly. All the banks are coming up with their own solutions to financing renewable energy installations for small businesses. There are also tax breaks now on offer that the South African government has put in place. There's options now like renting solar and battery installations. So it's increasingly accessible. It used to be, I think, very difficult for smaller businesses. It's still obviously not straightforward and accessible to everyone, unfortunately. But the options there, we've come a very long way, and there are plenty of options nowadays.
Fantastic, thanks. And to the people down in the audience, don't forget to put your hands up if you want to jump into the conversation. Remember, participation is great. Peanut, over to you.
Thanks, Joseph. So I just wanted to ask you, Nick, in the South African. Okay, so just before I do that, let me just give a context to my question. So in Europe, the Russian-Ukraine war and what happened with Russian oil suddenly got everybody dusting off their renewable energy plans, and we know that those plans to actually break their reliance on Russian gas and that fossil fuel source has accelerated what's been happening in Europe. Now in South Africa, we have a similar situation, except of course in our case this is not a war, but we have had one of the dirtiest electricity generation systems on the African continent. But that system has progressively broken down for various reasons. The government obviously has been a bit tardy in moving away from coal for various reasons as well. So a lot of them got to do with money coming back into the government, etc. But now suddenly we have this mass adoption on almost like a household by household. Household by household are adopting renewable energy. Just do you have a sense of the speed at which small businesses and households in the South African context are switching to renewable energy at the moment?
There are some stats that have come out. I wish I knew them off the top of my head, but I think.
But it's quite rapid, right?
It's massive. It's very sudden. So imports of, I think, inverters was at, don't quote me on these stats, I think they're right. Imports of inverters in 2022 were like 11 billion rand. Batteries were somewhere around 20, and solar panels also massive. It's just a sudden spike that's like completely unlike anything South Africa's ever seen before. And it's obviously, I think there was always a hesitancy by households and small businesses about going this route because everyone sort of assumed rolling blackouts would end soon-ish. So they thought maybe it's not something that we need to worry about. And I think the latest sort of decline into what's a far more serious situation has woken a lot of people up. So I think things are accelerating massively, and so I guess and have grid capacity issues, but it just shows that the appetite from small and large businesses and households is completely there. Grid constraints will be an issue going forward, but we've ramped up into fifth gear. That's
So when you say that, you're talking about largely within the context of South Africa or internationally, because to be quite honest with you, I'm struggling to recognise this world of fast adaptation. If I look around my area, I don't see anybody with solar panels. I see lots of people demonstrating against turbines. I'm just not seeing it. So am I just unlucky, or is there something else going on?
I guess there are pockets of ultra fast change all over the world. There's always going to be the sort of leaders and the laggards. I think one area that's really exciting is Australia. Australia is moving at like really breakneck speed in that direction. The US is finally really accelerating things thanks to tax incentives in the climate law. There are parts of Europe that are really moving fast. There has been a bit of a hold up with new legislation coming online and disagreements on the types of incentives on offer. There hasn't been a huge amount happening in most of Africa, which is quite worrying. All the stats from IRENA and the IEA show Africa is falling very, very far behind, which obviously is a risk in that it means a less competitive economy as the rest of the world shifts to cleaner and cheaper sources of energy that also help to attract capital. So it's definitely not a universal increase in ambition and speed, but there's a lot happening. China is another one. China, the amount of investment in solar, wind, and battery in China is just insane. It's they're way ahead of their own ambitious targets. So that's good to see.
So
it makes me wonder. Go ahead, Peter.
Joseph, I wanted to ask you. You don't think that the reason why that is in the area that you are is because France, up until very recently, their nuclear energy was basically what was supplying the country. And so there's no need really in the minds of people to switch to things like solar, etc. Do you think that had an impact maybe?
Yeah, possibly. But again, I guess that takes us down actually another completely different tangent about the energy transition. I mean, as you probably know, in France, Macron has been framing nuclear as green. And this is a perception that's kind of changing almost before our eyes. I mean, it was probably only, what would it have been, about 5 years ago now that James Lovelock came on board saying that we've probably got to start going down the nuclear path, given that people aren't moving quick enough with scaling traditional renewable energies. And that was the first time I remembered anybody who kind of thought seriously about the environment proposing nuclear as a genuine kind of climate orientated solution. But now here in France, we've got Macron very strongly and aggressively pushing it as a climate solution. Nick, in your mind, do you consider nuclear to be part of this kind of quote unquote energy transition?
It's such a contested space. And you see, obviously, nuclear was included in the EU's green taxonomy, can basically qualify as a green investment. But now there are a whole lot of NGOs and civil society groups and science-based organizations challenging that. It differs from country to country. So France sees nuclear playing a huge role going forwards. The US, to some extent, countries in the East, like South Korea, also are sort of seeing a nuclear renaissance. But if you look at the stats in terms of planned electricity builds, the vast majority of new capacity being brought online globally in the next 5 or 10 years is renewables. There is some nuclear in the mix. It's a very tricky one. I think the main argument against it is that nuclear is, by 2030, we need to cut emissions by half, basically. And nuclear takes 10, 15 years to build, often up to 2 decades. So it's just too expensive and too slow to be part of a serious push to cut emissions. That's the sort of biggest argument against its inclusion, as well as, to a lesser extent, I think things like managing nuclear waste and the risk of anything going wrong. But it's a highly contested space. I think one thing in my mind that seems a bit odd is when countries like Germany shut down nuclear plants and instead keep their coal plants open. So shutting down one source of clean energy and keeping coal alive, but they have their own reasons for that, which are fairly compelling if you do go into them. So it's really contested terrain. I think the only countries that can really go after it are wealthier countries with access to capital markets, deep capital markets, because nuclear plants don't come cheap at all. There's a lot of hope, obviously, that we'll get things like small modular reactors come online, and that'll really drive a nuclear renaissance. But it's very unproven tech, and until it is proven, it's not really something that should be considered.
Nick, I have a question for you that's just come up for me. So in this whole transition that has to happen, whether it's a personal transition, how you use energy, what energy you use, how efficient you become in your energy use, or whether it goes the next level, which is a company, or then nationwide. What role, in your view, does climate literacy play in this whole discussion? Individual climate literacy, would you say?
Yeah, I think, it's everything. If you don't really understand the whole crux of the issue, everything else makes a whole lot less sense. And I think climate literacy is the biggest challenge to getting real momentum in the transition. Most people choose to kind of tune out of anything climate related because it's a difficult topic and it's not really something that you want to think about. So I think there has to be a willingness to want to further your climate knowledge. And also, to be honest, it's just going to become an issue that becomes more and more big and important. And if it's something that you just keep putting off and not wanting to get into, you're going to be left behind at some point, because it's an issue that's very much here to stay and will only accelerate. And I mean, particularly for business leaders, in South Africa, there's still a lot of climate illiterate business leaders, and obviously politicians more so. But in the business space, there's still a lot of leaders who really don't seem to quite grasp what's at stake here and just how quickly things are changing on the energy front and on the climate front.
So one follow up on this. In the examples that you've seen where the transition is really working well, I mean, I know you mentioned Australia, but maybe there are some cities, or what of those examples has excited you the most about the possibility of a transition?
I think South Australia is my kind of go-to example, and I keep a very close eye on what's happening there. That South Australia includes Adelaide. It's got a sizable enough mining industry, manufacturing industry, so it is a little microcosm of a bigger economy elsewhere. It's not big and it's not a massive electricity user, but it sort of shows what can be done. So I think in a nutshell, the story is basically that I think it was 2015 or maybe 2016, South Australia suffered, at the time, it was quite a fossil fuel intensive little economy. They suffered some major blackouts due to a severe storm that knocked out transmission lines. And while they were basically trying to get everything back on track in the months that followed, there was that quite famous tweet where Mike Cannon-Brookes, an Aussie billionaire, tweeted to Elon Musk saying, "Can you help us out?" And Elon said, "Cool, we'll set up a big battery there in 100 days, or it's free, 100 days from signing the contract." And everyone sort of thought it was a joke, but Tesla actually went in there and they did it. And it was the first big battery installation in the world. Batteries was quite a new technology and untested then. But Tesla put in one of its mega batteries, and it was the first really big one in the world. And since then, it sort of sparked something in South Australia that they decided, okay, let's like really push ahead with this transition. Since then, they've really scaled up on solar and wind. They're adding a couple of transmission lines to neighboring states. They've shut down the last of their coal-fired power plants. They now only have 2 gas-fired power plants, which run at very low capacity factors. And part of the reason that they're on is just to provide system strength, just keep the grid sort of healthy and keep electrons running through the grid at the right pace and voltage and all of that. But those services are increasingly being sort of muscled out by big batteries, which can do exactly the same thing that a gas-fired power plant can do, but now at a cheaper cost, actually. So there are only 2 smallish gas-fired power plants still operational in South Australia, but the plan is to basically eradicate those and shut everything and complete the transition to 100% wind, solar, and batteries in the next couple of years. So maybe about 2026 at the latest, which is very ambitious. Then there's also plans in South Australia to add green hydrogen power plants, which are basically the same as a gas-fired power plant, but running on green hydrogen, where the hydrogen is made from excess solar and wind power during the day and then burned to create energy at peak times or when needed. So, I mean, South Australia is just country miles ahead of the rest of Australia, but the rest of Australia is really catching up quite quickly now. One interesting thing there is, because South Australia obviously had to invest quite heavily into these things before a lot of the cost declines had really reflected. In the early days of the transition, their power prices were more expensive than the rest of the Aussie grid, but they're now a lot cheaper than the Australian average. In the coal-reliant states like Victoria, power prices are a hell of a lot higher. So the spike in fossil fuel prices after the invasion of Ukraine really saw South Australia's comparative power prices decline even further. So yeah, that to me is the most interesting little mini case study.
So
Nick, I want to go off on a little tangent, if I may. I guess it's leveraging Peter's earlier point about climate literacy, right? At heart, you're a climate communicator, right? As a journalist, you're there telling compelling stories about climate to your audience. So what I wanted to do is just explore a little bit about what the most effective way of communicating these issues are. I note, listening to this conversation over the past half hour, that all 3 of us have settled into this kind of rational way of communicating. We tell the facts. This is the good side. This is the bad side. If you do this, society will be better. Climate change will be mitigated. And I think for many of us who have kind of got slightly more technical backgrounds, so for those of us particularly with progressive political backgrounds, we tend to rely on this kind of rational way of communication to tell stories.
Yeah.
Also, I notice here on LinkedIn, I'm continually getting these kind of contesting debates going on about it. Should we communicate climate by making people fall? Or should we communicate climate by making people scared? There doesn't seem to be a consensus on which is the best way forward. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this, about what you think is the most effective way of communicating what is arguably the most complicated subject of humanity.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. There's a lot of psychologists who've been studying what actually works best, what doesn't work. One thing that seems to not work, at least to the majority of the population, is the sort of scary stories about how climate change will destroy crop yields and food security and basically transform the world into a hellish environment, which is not too far off the truth, but it's not a message that resonates with people. As soon as people hear stuff like that, if it's not an immediate threat, that, in other words, something that will happen tomorrow, they just tune out. It's not something, it's a sort of automatic reaction our brains have to that kind of scenario and news. Just like, I guess, if you a warning about if you smoke, you'll have problems. You could face some major health problems in 10, 20 years' time. It's just not something people really want to think about. So that's something that doesn't work for most of the population. There are segments of the population who are receptive to that and who it does resonate with, but for most people it doesn't. I think the thing that really resonates the most is the more positive spin on things. And I think this was something that was really difficult 10 years ago when, say, clean energy was more expensive than fossil fuels. You only really had a negative argument to use. Now you have the argument about all the opportunities that come with actually addressing climate change. And that obviously includes cheaper and cleaner energy, cleaner air, access to finance if you're a business, those kinds of things. So to me, I find the positive messages resonate a lot better as well, and that includes things like prospects for job creation and in the US reviving US manufacturing industry. Things like that seem to resonate best. People want to know how they may benefit, I guess.
Cool. I was just got a quick follow-up question, but before I do that, just to remind people that you do have the ability to stick your hand up, come and ask some questions, add to the conversation or comments. Let me just get this quick follow-up question through, and then hopefully we'll get somebody else up. As a journalist, right, and this as a climate communicator, how do you feel about the role that the media has to play in this issue? I'm sure you're aware that if you look at like veracity indexes for the media, a lot of people, well, in fact, the significant majority of people have lost confidence in the media.
Yeah.
Do you feel that the media has lost the ability to effectively have people's confidence? Does it need to be rebuilt, or do you think really the story may well be better suited to be told elsewhere, either by people in positions of authority like governments, or potentially even TikTok influencers who have got a more kind of organically developed reputation? How do you feel that the media fares at the moment in this domain?
So all of those sort of stakeholders have their own role to play, and the media obviously is still massive. There are huge trust issues in the media, and it's a space that's been weaponized by politicians and some in the business space. But it's still incredibly important. One thing that still sort of blows a lot of scientists' minds is that when new IPCC reports are released, for example, it's still sort of making page 3 news, even though it's some massive analysis and news about what our collective future holds. So it's still something that's just not quite prominent enough in the media. Another thing that really is annoying me in the South African media landscape is a lot of publications will publish, say, for example, what our energy minister says verbatim and not add any context. So if our energy minister says renewable energy doesn't work and Europe shows that because it's buying our coal, there's nowhere in the article to sort of add the broader context that is absolutely not the case. And while Europe's temporarily firing up 1 or 2 old coal-fired power stations, the trend is very much in the opposite direction. So I think the media needs to step up its game when it comes to contextualizing things that politically driven politicians say. But overall messaging absolutely has to increase. Still, there's such a long way to go to give climate the the level of coverage it deserves.
So if I'm thinking around major mainstream media outlets that are doing a pretty decent job of the climate, the one that springs to mind is probably The Guardian, who I think more than anyone else it does a reasonable job. They got an environment tab at the top of their website, but I find that even they kind of sometimes lose the plot a bit and go into some quite contestable kind of avenues of argument. I'm sure you've looked quite recently. There's been two big ones. There's the supposed expose of the validity of carbon credits. They've also gone on the attack big time recently on carbon capture technology, and obviously this very complex got the right idea. So even what I perceive to be the best media outlet, I think doesn't quite get it right. Who would you recommend as the kind of internationally, the kind of publication that most people might be inclined to use for their regular news? Who do you think does the best job?
Yeah, I agree. And I think the Guardian, great in a lot of respects, does sort of those fear-driven headlines, which I don't think helps their credibility and sort of makes people switch off. So I think while the Guardian's at least giving this a lot of airtime, it's maybe going about it the wrong way. I fully agree. Maybe two that come to mind. One is Bloomberg. I think Bloomberg's come a fairly long way. They obviously look at things from the business perspective, but I think they're doing a pretty good job of climate coverage and the transition in general. And another one that I really enjoy is Axios, in a US publication. You can sign up for their daily climate and energy newsletter, and it's pretty comprehensive and very much a neutral tone that sort of looks at the pros and cons of each update and delivers news in a very digestible way. So that one's pretty good to me, Axios, but Bloomberg as well.
Nick, and maybe Joseph, you can tell me if you've actually seen this, and Nick, I want to ask you if you've seen this too. In France, there's a television station that during their weather report, they are now contextualizing the weather with what's happening with the climate. I don't know if you've actually seen reporting on that, or yourself, Joseph, if you've actually seen that. But my opinion is that those kind of platforms that are available to governments while this transition has to happen, etc., is extremely powerful. Because I mean, when you're watching the weather forecast and you now see it put into the context of why are we experiencing these crazy heat waves, like for example happening in Spain right now? Why is this happening? And explaining the temperature, that's our heating process. In fact, I think they've got a bar that actually runs during the presentation where it actually shows how far we've heated, pre-industrial, which is really innovative. What do you think?
It's brilliant. Sorry, Joseph, do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say it's brilliant. It wasn't really possible before because scientists have always been very hesitant to link things like a specific heat wave to climate change because there's no way of knowing if it would have happened in a world without climate change. But scientists have come a very long way in what we call attribution studies, where you can look at a particular event and see what the likelihood of that happening in a world without climate change was and compare it to the likelihood of it happening now. So you can say this heat wave in Spain has been made 500 times more likely by 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming that the planet has gone through. So it's a new tool, and it's great to see that French stations are starting to use that. I think another one and on the flip side of that, you have publications like the BBC, which will report on heat waves, but in quite a positive way, and they'll talk about how it's like time to go to the beach, and no mention whatsoever of climate change or what might be causing that heat wave. So there's quite a divergence happening there. Another one that I think is quite important to link, and some economists at least are starting to make the link, and it's finding its way into the news media, is the link between extreme weather events driven by climate change and food prices and food security. So Spain, back to the Spanish example, is facing food shortages and higher food prices, specifically linked to extreme heat last year and this year. That is pushing down crop yields. So contextualizing what's driving heat waves and what's driving higher food prices and food shortages is extremely important, and something the media should be giving more attention to.
That really got me thinking, Peter. And again, it kind of, once more, we come back to the idea of COVID being a little kind of example of things to come. Because I remember when I was teaching undergraduates during COVID, and I was often bringing in conversations about, more kind of authoritarian and really heavy climate issues that the government could take. And first of all, the students will say, "Oh no, we can't accept having our air miles rationed, or we can't accept having our meat taken away," and stuff like this. And then I would always say, how many of you stayed at home during the lockdown? Of course, they all put their hands up. And how many of you took the vaccine? And most of them put their hands up. And I said, well, you've already existed in this authoritarian regime. Why wouldn't you do it for climate? And then the first answer that we always get back from the students is fear, because we were worried about death. And then they point to the fact that the media would show them, there were 500 COVID deaths in France today. There were 20,000 COVID infections in France today. And you would literally get it. It's like blinking red live feed of numbers. And I said, okay, so you were afraid. So you've accepted these pretty draconian measures because you were afraid. And then the follow-up question I always like to give is, how many people do you think die globally every year through air pollution due to coal-fired power plants? And then there's usually a long silence, and they start having a think. And usually someone might say, like a million, and everyone looks around and goes, that's just a crazy number. That's a huge number. And of course, then you tell them the real number, which I think from memory is something like 8 million people a year, every single year, dying from air pollution due to coal-powered fire plants. So I said, imagine what would happen if, as you said, Peter, the weather report told you that today there were, we statistically worked this out, today there were 500 deaths from air pollution. There were 500 from forever chemicals. There were 500 from microplastics. There were 500 from heat deaths. And you were getting this live information every single day in the way that you did with COVID. Would that make you feel differently about climate? Would you accept measures that at the moment seem unreasonable? And then they start getting it. So maybe the weather report really does need to have different types of statistics.
Nick, I want to ask you something with a follow-up on this. So in yours, I mean, this is just coming from you. It's a subjective question. I mean, you're not going to be held to this, but if you think of all the research you've done on this topic, how do you, if you had to sort of give a talk to maybe a group of business leaders or even government officials, what would your story be about how we progress from here until 2030 and then a little beyond? In your mind, what is that story? What do you think actually happens here?
I'd probably start with the opportunity at hand, and it's very far-reaching in every segment of the economy. Also looking at those examples that are out there, there's been a push to get, for example, South Australia's energy planners to come to South Africa and actually speak to our energy ministry and speak to Eskom and tell them how they're going about this. So on the one hand, it's opportunity. It's I think what's quite important is having a vision of where you want to be in 10 years' time, how much new capacity you want to have added, what start you want to have in electrifying transport and things like that. And then on the other hand, it's being very aware of the risks of falling behind. Once you start falling behind, it's going to be very much like falling behind in the tech space. If you're falling very far behind in the adoption of technology and artificial intelligence, you're going to become an uncompetitive company and or country. If you fall far behind in the energy transition, it's going to be very, very similar. You're going to lose out on access to capital. You're going to pay more for your electricity bills. There's very much a risk and reward side to this, opportunity and risks of not transitioning.
You may think this is a strange question, but it's actually related to all this. Have either of you, Joseph or yourself, Nick, have you seen the Apple TV series that came out recently entitled Extrapolations? Have either of you seen that?
I have, yes, I have. Do you want me to speak about that, or do you got a follow-up question first?
No, please go ahead.
Yeah, listen. Well, first of all, from like a narrative point of view, it was very disappointing. It was wooden as hell. I really wanted to like it, but I didn't. But that doesn't mean that it didn't bring up lots of interesting climate discussions. But one of the things that I really felt about that show is actually bound in with this word extrapolations. So they extrapolate these issues into the future, whatever the years were, starting off at, I think, the year 2037. And then by episode 8, which I watched a couple of days ago, I think we were up to the year 2070 or something like that. And one of the things that I felt that they actually got really wrong about the idea of extrapolations was how far into the future they extrapolated stuff. So like in the last episode, 2070, we're told that in the year 2050, the International Court introduced an ecocide law. You know, the European Parliament is already drafting an ecocide law right now. It's not going to be 2050. And by 2070, there were only 11 people who had been tried for this. Everything's going to come much sooner. And I think this was the big problem that this show actually probably unintentionally did, is it did that whole thing of kind of where we were at a decade ago, thinking that it was a generation or more away. I think everything that we're learning now is that everything's happening much faster than we originally imagined. And I think the show kind of did a disservice suggesting that many of these issues are going to hit us in 50 years' time. They're going to hit us in 5 years' time.
I think that's a point in itself, is people underestimate how fast things are changing. The International Energy Agency has constantly fallen way short in its projections on EV adoption, on the shift to clean energy. If even they're getting it wrong, I mean, everyone thinks the move to clean energy is going to take a lot longer than I think it is going to take. Once you've crossed these tipping points where clean energy and clean energy plus battery storage is cheaper than things like gas, it's just it accelerates the transition so much. I think another thing to bear in mind is as we're heading into an El Nino weather phase, I think for a lot of people this is going to be a real wake-up call about climate change, because El Nino is going to amplify the sort of heating that's been going on behind the surface. And I think for a lot of people, this will be the first time that they really the impact of climate change hit home. And that's just going to accelerate all thinking and policy making and action on the transition tenfold. So things are happening a lot faster than people understand.
Yeah, did you watch it, Peter?
Yes, I did actually, and my view of this was a little different to yours, Joseph. I actually thought that they brought the science to the fore and showed this dual thing of the climate deteriorating, but mankind attempting to continue with their capitalism and the whole growth idea. And meanwhile, you've got this thing playing out in the background, which is just getting worse and worse and worse. In fact, last night, I watched an interview with the directors of that series, and I'll actually afterwards just share it with everyone if you want to have a look at it. But the guy made an interesting comment. He said, at the moment, like if you take on Apple TV where this is being broadcast, he said that it's the only series that relates to climate. And he says that what he thinks is going to happen very shortly is that any series that's made is going to have elements of the climate crisis embedded in the story, because it's going to be something that is just a lived experience of a lot of people. And he felt that, where these days you have something like Don't Look Up or Extrapolations or, these kind of documentaries that show up every so often on the streaming services. He says that his opinion is that shortly, whether you're watching a series about the FBI or whatever it is that you're watching, some crime story or whatever, that all of them will have elements of the climate crisis. And his opinion was that he feels that that is another very important step that needs to be taken, almost like I mentioned earlier regarding the TV broadcasts with weather, putting that into context. We've basically come to the end of our discussion, and I want to say, Nick, I appreciate the time that you've taken to have a chat to us. For everybody that would like to connect with you, what is the best place? I mean, obviously LinkedIn is one, so if you click on Nick's profile, you'll be able to connect with him. And then I see he's just put up his Twitter profile as well, which you can have a look at. So any concluding comments from you there, Nick?
Well, just thanks very much for having me. Interesting chat. I'm glad you're raising these kinds of conversations. I think they're only going to become more frequent and more intense. So thanks for having me.
Great stuff. And yourself, Joseph, just from concluding comments from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole idea, I think we probably should do another episode of this on climate communications, because I think we really need to be able to have some confidence, I think, about what the best way forward. I mean, I feel that we've started something that I want to continue in much greater depth. There probably needs to be something, maybe it's a question that kind of needs to be looked at via the lens of whichever person happens to be speaking, which kind of brings me to the point, no doubt we'll be doing this again next month. So please do check out the posts on our feeds. Make sure you connect with us so that you get notice of when our next episode is. It will probably, although I can't tell for sure, be the same time next month.
Great stuff. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Nick. And for those of you that have stayed here with us until the end of the conversation, we have recorded this, so we will put this up and share the link in the event group and also on our LinkedIn profiles when that goes live. So great stuff, everybody. Have a great Wednesday, whether it's evening or morning, wherever you are. Goodbye.
Take care, everyone.